Hi, everybody, it's Heather, and this is my Wednesday check-in after Ash Wednesday worship and meditation last week. We're back on our regular schedule. We're into Lent. This is the first full week of Lent, and somebody asked me this week as we were talking about some worship planning whether or not a piece of music was too happy for Lent. Now, if you grew up with the tradition of Lent, you know that Lent is the 40 days, not counting Sundays, before Easter. And in the church calendar, it's been a time which has been very sober. A lot of people give up things for Lent. A lot of people, feel like it's a really serious time. In medieval times, and in fact, into fairly recently as well, people gave up eating eggs and milk and meat for Lent, which is the origin of the Shrove Tuesday pancake supper, because you eat up all the eggs and the meat and the milk in your cupboard and get rid of it before Lent began. So there's this idea of Lent as a sober and sad time, and I mean, for me, it is that. I think that Lent is a time when we can spend some time in the church thinking about some of the darker sides of faith, and some of the more difficult passages of faith. You know, the situations where it feels like we're walking in the shadows, the valley of the shadow of death, and we're not quite sure whether or not we're going to make it out the other side. I think a religion that can only deal with happy times and is never able to look at the sad times is a religion that's deeply flawed and doesn't give people much help when they're going through the times when things are not so good. But the other thing that I think is that sad times do not rule out happy times. And very often when you're going through the darkness or the difficulties, when I say darkness, what I mean is times when it seems like your way is not very clear. You can't see where you're going. You can't see how this is going to end well. When we're going through times, I found, and I think other people have told me too, that it's surprising how sometimes happiness breaks in, or humor, or laughter, all those kinds of things that I consider to be gifts from God. I remember my very first experience of death in my family was when my grandfather passed, and I was in my 20s by then. It was the first person really close to me who had passed in my family, the first family funeral maybe even I'd been to. My grandfather had had a series of strokes starting 4 years earlier. He himself, I think, was not living his best life, although he had many things that were a good quality of life. But I think he was experiencing his losses more. He was in his late 80s. It was in many ways a natural death. He had died with loved people around him, and lots of love surrounded our experience for the rest of the time. And we sat down together. We talked about issues of life and death. My younger siblings and cousins, I remember, came to me and said, "What do you think happens to people after they die?" And I can't even remember what I answered them, but I remember my aunt saying later, "I was sure glad they asked you that question and not me." It might have been one of the first inklings that maybe a professional life of faith was part of where I was going. And I remember my other aunt, though, saying, after we had sat for an evening and told stories and we found ourselves laughing and carrying on, it was good to be together as a family. She said, "I had no idea that you could both laugh and cry at the same time." And I think that was a really important lesson for me, whether we're talking about the seriousness of a death in the family or whether we're talking about rituals like Lent and those parts of our church year. I think it's important to remember that sadness and sorrow and trouble are best faced with an understanding that sometimes joy breaks through into the midst of our work. You know, God, I think, is able to be present in all places. And sometimes the laughter and the joy that is given to you in those times is what gives you what you need to be able to carry on. Some early Lent thoughts from me. I hope that joy breaks through into wherever you are this week, and we'll talk to you soon. Heather out.